You already know one. You just didn't have the language for it yet.
You're listening to Unbound Presents Dangerous Minds. Beth Curry talks about whatever the hell she wants. And this time, what she wants to talk about is psychopaths, narcissists, killers, and the people who made them that way. You asked for it. Repeatedly. Here's hoping you can handle it.
Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to Unbound Off Script. I'm Beth Curry, forensics person, author, podcast host, annoying bitch, whatever I am. And apparently the person your algorithm sends you to when you have questions about why people do terrible things to each other, which honestly, fair enough. Just some quick housekeeping before we get into this. I wanted to share something kind of meaningful to me. The opening and closing music has a story behind it, and the end of episode 5, I will close out the series with the song in its entirety instead of just portions that fit my sound engineer opted to use for my intro and my outro. So this special series features a unique musical collaboration that spans nearly a decade. So the foundation is an original solo guitar recording by Jeremy. If you know me well, you know of him. And it's from 2017. He recorded it, as he often did, just recording his covers and his own stuff on his guitar. He was really into guitar and piano and all that great stuff. In 2026, Nate transformed it. Actually, it is 2026. This year, Nate transformed it into a full... I guess it's about 3 minutes, 3-minute composition, layering in his own piano and drum performances to create an entirely new piece inspired by Jerry's original. And the finished song, named Sea Smoke for me, is pretty much a collaboration across time, I'd say. I think it's really special. It is to me. You know, these two guys who've always meant a lot to me from near and far created a song that I have the privilege of using for this series. So, there we go. I've been getting a version of the same question from listeners for a while now. It shows up in my inbox or in reviews or in direct messages or anything like that. Sometimes it's specific, you know, someone describing a person in their life and wanting to kind of understand them. And sometimes it's a bit broader, more of a genuine curiosity about why some people become violent or manipulative or just completely indifferent to the damage that they leave behind. You know, this question started being asked kind of consistently after the conclusion of season 3, where I talked about my trauma and my abuser. So anyway, because I'm a psychology freak, I'm dedicating the next 5 episodes to answering these questions properly. This is the Dangerous Minds series, and today is part 1, The Making of a Monster, which is a dramatic title, but accurate. I've kind of been sitting on this topic for a while, you know, not because I didn't have things to say. I always have things to say. That's never been the problem, but because I wanted to do it properly. You know, I spent years kind of doing the forensic stuff, working, volunteering, studying. I've studied this at an academic level, a clinical level, and occasionally a very personal and uncomfortable level, as you all know if you did listen to season 3. And like I said, I keep getting these messages from people who are looking for something more substantive, like what they were finding or what I was even giving. So here we are, 5 episodes. Before I get into the actual psychology, I want to establish something that I think is important and that a lot of true crime content gets completely wrong. Okay. Dangerous people are not a separate species. And it's uncomfortable. You know, we prefer to think that they are. We prefer to imagine that there is some visible difference between us and them, like a tell or a look or something in the eyes that we would recognize immediately if we ever encountered it. And that's not how it works, which is frankly part of what makes them dangerous. So I'm going to start out with why we get this wrong. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures. I've talked about this before. Most of us know this. We want explanations that make sense. You know, categories that hold and villains who look like villains, right? Like the cartoons. It is deeply uncomfortable to sit with the reality that the person who caused serious harm to someone you love or to you could also be, by most outward measures, completely normal looking. So we reach for easy answers, right? Bad seed, evil, born that way. And while there's genuine science behind some of those ideas, we will absolutely get into the neuroscience in part two. The full picture is almost always more complicated than that, and it's more tragic than we would really want it to be. The question isn't just what someone became, it's how, and it's what conditions had to exist. It's what went wrong and when, and whether any of anything, in fact, could have interrupted it, right? Those are the questions that forensic psychology actually asks, and they are a lot more useful than, were they just born evil? Which is a question that sounds profound and answers exactly nothing. And I will say for the record, forensics is not CSI. Nobody in my world has ever dramatically pulled off their sunglasses and solved a damn thing, okay? We mostly read a lot of paperwork and disagree with each other in very formal language. So, there's three pillars. There's nature, nurture, and the space between. When researchers and clinicians try to understand how a dangerous person is made, they are generally looking at three overlapping areas. They look at biology, environment, and experience. Nature, nurture, and the space between, right? So I'm going to start with biology because it's the one people find most alarming, I guess. There are real documented neurological differences in people who go on to develop antisocial patterns. Okay. The prefrontal cortex, that's the part of the brain responsible for impulse control, empathy, decision making, capacity to think past the immediate moment, those kinds of things. It shows measurable differences in structure and function in individuals with psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder. The amygdala, which is responsible for processing fear and emotional response, shows reduced reactivity in psychopathic individuals, which means, basically, they do not feel fear the way the rest of us do, right? They also process the distress of other people differently. There's less response, less activation, and less of what we would call normal emotional mirroring, if that makes sense. There are also strong genetic components. Twin studies, which researchers love because they let you kind of tease apart what's heritable versus what's environmental. They consistently show that traits like callousness and impulsivity and aggression and those kinds of things have significant genetic contributions. Now, does that mean that some people are just born dangerous? Not exactly. What it means is that some people are born with a nervous system that makes certain pathways easier and certain safeguards weaker. What happens after that depends enormously on environment. I remember the first time this kind of really landed for me, not so much as a concept, but as a reality. Sitting with this file, not even a person, it was just a file, and kind of tracing back through the chronology of someone's life and thinking, at what point was this inevitable? And the answer, most of the time, is that it wasn't. There were junctures, right? Like there were these moments where a different response from the environment could have sent things in a different direction. That's not comforting exactly, but I think it's important. So that brings us to environment. If biology loads the gun, environment pulls the trigger. That's a line that gets used a lot in criminology, and I love it, and I find it slightly annoying because it's accurate, but it also kind of leaves out the part where sometimes the gun misfires and sometimes it never goes off at all, right? But as a starting point, it works. So the environmental factors most consistently linked to the development of antisocial or violent or dangerous behavior are childhood trauma. So not all trauma creates dangerous people. Let me be very clear about that because that's a harmful and inaccurate leap that I think a lot of people tend to make. The vast majority of trauma survivors do not become violent or predatory, but trauma, particularly chronic early trauma, does actually disrupt the developing brain in ways that can amplify existing vulnerabilities. It affects stress response systems, and it shapes kind of how a child learns to attach to other people or whether they learn to attach at all. I want to pause here for a second because this one isn't abstract for me. Someone close to me was diagnosed as an adult with avoidant personality disorder. And when I learned more about his history, it wasn't a mystery. He and his brother had been abused by their babysitter and her boyfriend when they were young. Childhood, right? The age where you're supposed to be completely safe and completely protected. They weren't. And what they did to him, the way he moved through the world, the way he kept people at a distance, the way Intimacy felt like a threat even when he wanted it. That was the fingerprint of what happened to him. AVPD is an adaptation, right? It's what a nervous system does when closeness has been made dangerous. And I think about him when I talk about this stuff, and I think it's worth saying that. So the next one is neglect. And neglect is arguably more damaging in the long term than many forms of active abuse, and it gets far less attention. A child whose emotional needs are consistently unmet, like a child who isn't soothed or mirrored or not taught how to regulate distress, learns to exist without emotional attunement. That wiring set early is extremely hard to change later. Um, there's also inconsistent or coercive parenting. So children need predictability, not perfection. They need predictability. When the rules change constantly, when affection is used as a reward and withdrawn as a punishment, or when the attachment figure is also the source of fear, children adapt and they learn to read rooms and they learn to manipulate and they learn that relationships are transactional. And those lessons don't disappear at all once they grow up. Exposure to violence is another one, both witnessing violence and experiencing it directly. The normalization of coercion is as a way of getting what you need, right? They learned this association between power and safety. So there's that. There's also peer rejection and social marginalization, particularly relevant in the development of mass violence, which we'll get into in part 4, I believe. Social exclusion is not a trivial stressor, right? So for individuals already carrying biological vulnerabilities and early attachment wounds, chronic social rejection can be a significant escalating factor. So there's a part nobody talks about enough, in my opinion, and it's attachment. So I want to spend some real time here because I think attachment theory is one of the most underutilized explanatory, if I could speak, frameworks in public conversations about dangerous people. John Bowlby, attachment theory. He developed it in the mid-20th century and expanded it, or it has been expanded significantly by researchers ever since. And it tells us that humans are hardwired to form attachment bonds with caregivers. Okay. It's biological. Infants who can't form attachment don't just become lonely, but they kind of fail to develop neurologically in the ways that make social functioning possible. When those early attachment bonds are secure, what is that word? My mouth, I don't know. It's too early for this. When they're secure, meaning the caregiver is responsive, attuned, and consistent, children develop what's called a secure base, right? They can explore the world. They can tolerate stress. They can regulate their emotions, and eventually they form healthy relationships with other people. But when those bonds are disrupted or distorted, children develop insecure attachment styles. And there is one in particular that shows up pretty damn consistently in the backgrounds of people who go on to harm others. Disorganized attachment is, this occurs when the caregiver is simultaneously the source of comfort and the source of fear. So when a child has nowhere to go, when the person they're supposed to run to for safety is also the person they need to escape from, the child's attachment system, I guess, just essentially short circuits, right? They can't approach. They can't avoid, and they are left with a neurological chaos that has these profound long-term consequences. Children with disorganized attachment are at significantly elevated risk for a range of difficulties in adulthood, like emotional dysregulation or relational aggression, sometimes difficulty with empathy or problems with impulse control. And they are also disproportionately represented in forensic populations. Now, I want to be careful here because I'm not saying that everyone with disorganized attachment becomes dangerous, right? That is absolutely not the case. But if you're trying to understand how someone became the way they are, this is frequently a significant piece of the story. I've sat across from case histories, where this was the through line, where the chaos of the early attachment environment was legible in literally everything that came after. The way someone described relationships, or the way that they talked about fear, or the way that they, learned to get needs met sideways, through manipulation or aggression, because the direct route had never once worked for them. It doesn't make what they did okay, but it does make it make sense, and there's a difference, and we always have to kind of pay attention to that difference. Um, I'm going to move on. Like, I've had listener questions, okay? And I promised that we would address the questions that people have actually, sent to me and had discussions with me in groups that I'm in. Um, so the first one is, can someone just choose to become dangerous? Like, is it ever purely a decision? Genuinely, I think that's a great question. And the honest answer is sometimes yes, mostly no. And always it's complicated. So there's a subset of individuals, and I think researchers probably argue about how large the subset is. But these people have the full neurological hardware for empathy and emotional regulation, but they make deliberate choices to exploit or harm others because it's advantageous to them for something, right? In forensic literature, you sometimes see this described as successful or subclinical psychopathy. These are people who function very well in the world, often in positions of power and who make calculated decisions to use other people. But for the majority of people who end up in forensic contents or contexts, it'd be like the people who are chronically violent or who engage in predatory behavior might be unable to sustain it's like relationships that they can't explore. Like choice is operating in a much more constrained system. Okay. Their capacity for impulse control is compromised, and their ability to project forward into consequences is limited, and their emotional world is kind of organized around threat and survival in ways that most of us literally cannot imagine. Okay. That doesn't mean they have no responsibility. Legal and moral responsibility are separate questions from psychological causation. But if you're trying to understand, not excuse, but understand, then they just chose to be that way is almost never the complete answer. Okay. Another question I've had is it nature or nurture? Can you just get dealt a bad hand from birth? Both, always both. A difficult biological starting point plus a difficult environment is a genuinely terrible combination. A difficult biological starting point plus a secure, attuned, consistent caregiving environment. The research suggests that this can significantly mitigate the risk, right? A relatively typical biological starting point plus chronic severe trauma can produce serious difficulties. So, what we've learned from decades of developmental research is that the brain is more plastic and more vulnerable than we used to think. What happens in the first years of life shapes neural architecture in ways that have lifelong consequences, for sure. So, yes, so some people do get dealt a genuinely shitty hand, right? Multiple hard hands, often at once. Someone else says, why do dangerous people often seem so normal, even charming? Because charm is a skill. It's not a character trait. I have had personal experience with this in a friendship that I was extremely misled in. And I've often said afterwards, she hid her meanness behind a pretty smile and a soft voice. But it was more than meanness. There was something else there that's just, anyway, charm is a skill. Okay. It's not a character trait. So for individuals with psychopathic or narcissistic features, social performance is something that is learned deliberately and deployed strategically. They study what works, and they're often excellent at reading what other people want, and they're reflecting it back successfully. The warmth that you experience in early contact with someone like this is real in the sense that it's happening, but it's not coming from the place warmth usually comes from. Make sense? So this is one of the most disorienting things for survivors of these relationships, or in my case, friendships, to come to terms with, because the person was genuinely charming. They were funny, they were engaging, they were attentive. They said all the right things. They made you feel happy and wanted and accepted and whatever else. But the problem is not that those moments were real, it's that they were instrumental, right? They were performed for a purpose. And once the purpose is served or the mask slips, you see something very different underneath. And like I said, I've been in rooms and in relationships where I experienced exactly what I just described. The charm was real, the attention was real, and then something shifted, and I found myself trying to reconcile two completely different people who occupied the same body, the same soft voice, and the same pretty smile. That reconciliation, by the way, isn't something you successfully complete. You just eventually stop trying. But we'll get into that in part 3, I believe. So, one of the questions that forensic researchers have spent a lot of time on is when antisocial and dangerous behavior patterns actually solidify, because understanding the developmental trajectory is essential if you're interested in prevention, which I am, and which part 5 of the series is going to dig into in depth. So the short version is that the research identifies these two main pathways. Okay, so there's childhood onset conduct problems, and this is the pathway that begins in early childhood, often before age 10, and involves persistent aggression or rule breaking, cruelty, disregard for others, those kinds of things. And this pathway is more strongly associated with biological vulnerabilities and more strongly linked to the severe end of adult antisocial behavior. And it's historically considered more resistant to intervention. Then we have the adolescent onset antisocial behavior, and this pathway begins in the teenage years, and it's far more common, and it's much more strongly linked to social and peer factors. And the majority of people on this pathway do not go on to serious adult offending. Okay, this is the kid who starts stealing cars at 15 and by 35 coaches his kid's baseball team and has mostly forgotten about it. This pathway is far more responsive to intervention. And I think that the difference between the two really matters, both for how we understand individual cases and for how we think about prevention. Treating all antisocial behavior as the same thing, which pop culture tends to do, means that we miss the fact that a significant portion of it is temporary and environmentally driven and very interruptible with the right support at the right time. What the childhood onset pathway often looks like in clinical practice involves a cluster of traits that researchers call callous unemotional traits. I guess like a reduced capacity for guilt or limited empathy, maybe a shallow affect, strong prioritization of self-interest. These traits in children are now recognized as early indicators of risk, and they are increasingly the focus of early intervention efforts, which is actually one of the more hopeful developments in this field, and I'll come back to that. So, I'm just going to spend a few minutes on something that I think gets lost when we have these conversations in an abstract academic frame. A lot of you are not asking these questions purely out of intellectual curiosity. I think you're asking because there's someone or was someone in your life, like a parent, a partner, or a sibling, a boss, an ex-friend, someone who did damage that didn't make sense, that you've been trying to organize into something comprehensible ever since. Believe me, I know. Understanding the psychology of how dangerous people are made can be genuinely useful in that process, okay? Not because it excuses anything, because it doesn't, but because understanding causation can interrupt the part of your brain that keeps asking, what the hell did I do wrong? Or why couldn't I fix it? Because sometimes the answer is you couldn't fix it because the conditions that created it predate you by decades. Because you were dealing with something that was built long before you arrived. I know that's not really a comfortable answer, but for a lot of people, it's pretty useful if you ask me. For me personally, the thing that shifted everything was having a word, just a word, a framework that said, this is a recognized pattern. It has a name. Other people have experienced it. It has been studied. That doesn't fix anything, but it kind of stops you from circling the drain of maybe I imagined it. You didn't imagine it. Okay? It has a name. So, what makes a dangerous person? Biology that makes certain traits easier and certain controls weaker. An environment that activates, amplifies, or fails to interrupt those traits. Early attachment disruptions that shape how someone learns to relate to other human beings. A developmental pathway that in some cases could have been redirected and in others was probably already deeply set before anyone thought to look. It's not just one thing. It's almost never just one thing. So tomorrow's episode, part 2, we're going to get into the actual categories, psychopathy, narcissism, antisocial personality disorder, borderline features, emotional violence, what they actually are, how they differ, how they kind of overlap with each other, and what labels mean and don't mean. Because I know a lot of you have wondered whether the word you've been reaching for actually fits, and I want to give you something more precise to work with. Okay? Thank you so much for listening. If you want to support the show, production costs or the time it takes me to research and develop these episodes for you, info is in the show notes. You can also rate, review, and share these episodes on your social media or with your friends. It all makes a difference to me. Thanks for being here. I'll see you tomorrow.
That's Dangerous Minds Unbound Off Script for people with slightly concerning taste in podcasts. Unbound is free to listen to. Show notes have everything you need if you want to support the show or get in touch with Beth. Thanks for listening. Probably says something about you that you made it this far. We mean that as a compliment.